Today we have yet another reason why Carl Sagan was a beast. There's a story that's largely untold about Sagan. It might be the case that Carl Sagan was integral in ending the Cold War. Let's get into it. So in 1980, paleontologists began to discover this KPG boundary across the entire world. They discovered this iridium layer in the Earth. And they found that this was related to the asteroid impact that destroyed the dinosaurs. Before that, recently discovered the crater impact in Yucatan Peninsula, and they made the connection between the iridium layer and the impact. So they realized that the dinosaurs likely died from the impact, causing all that debris and dust to get lofted into the atmosphere, covering the sun. And Carl Sagan and his colleagues looked at that, discovery, and they made the inference that perhaps it could be the case that the climate is really what destroyed the dinosaurs, the climatic changes that occurred. Now, remember, this was during the Cold War, right? The Soviet Union and the US were in a nuclear arms race. They kept building bombs to show who's stronger and who has the bigger guns, right? And Sagan had, done lots of work in this area, planetary sciences. He discovered, the greenhouse effect on Venus. He was working on climate change in the recent past, in late 1970s. He was working on Titan, looking at certain chemicals in Titan's atmosphere, looking to see what effects it has on the moon. So Sagan and his colleagues realized that this could pertain to climate change on Earth and perhaps nuclear war. So they decided to do some simulations. They used computer models. The computers in the 70s were very, very primitive. But they produced some models using some satellite data and probe data that they had. And the results from their experiments were extremely terrifying. They realized that the entire planet, the temperature of the globe, could decrease by 15 to 25 degrees Celsius for years on end if there were to be this, total nuclear war. In other words, all the dust and debris that was lofted from these nuclear impacts, very similar to what the asteroid did to the dinosaurs, would have lofted up into the air tons of debris and dust, blocking out the sun, making the Earth cooler by many degrees. And for a long time, there would be years without summers. I mean, even in the summertime, in places like Ukraine and, the Midwest of the US, where lots of grains are produced, wheat and corn, crop yields would decrease. There's not enough sun, there's not enough temperature for that to happen. So around the world, we would see people not only dying from the impact, hundreds of millions of people dying from impacts of nuclear war, but also the climatic impacts as well, from decreasing crop yields and lower temperatures, and this would cause a terrible cascade of negative effects on the environment. So essentially, they discovered that there was a nuclear war, it would be devastating for our entire civilization as we know it. Billions of people could potentially die, and it might be the actual end of our civilization. Now, this paper was going to be released in late December of 1983, and it was. But Carl Sagan realized that, no, we have to get the word out faster, right? And he wanted to really make it public. He really wanted people to see this. This was staggering, because before this moment, nobody understood what nuclear winter was, right? This is a brand new theory that had just come out. And, Sagan wanted people to know this. Remember, Sagan at the time just came out with Cosmos. He was quite popular. So he realized that, hey, wait a minute, we have this staggering information, and I can use my fame to, spread the word. And he did. In October of 1983, Sagan wrote a special piece for the Parade magazine. Now, the Parade magazine was, like the modern day Twitter, right? Everybody has access to it, right? It's tens of millions of people see this. So he made sure that the cover of this magazine, in the Parade magazine, would have the words, nuclear war, could it be the end of the world, right? He wanted people to be like, whoa, what is this all about? And it worked. People started talking about it. Now, President Reagan at the time and his administration didn't understand this, of course, and they thought that nuclear war was winnable, right? That it was survivable at least. But Sagan wanted to sound the alarms to people, show them, no, it's not winnable. There are no winners if there is a nuclear war. But Sagan began to realize that this was an obligation for him. Now, right before this, Sagan was having an operation on his esophagus. He had to get it replaced. He almost nearly died from this operation. Now, when he was in the hospital bed, right, when he was in the intensive care unit, President Reagan was on national television, declaring that he was going to, initiate this SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. He wanted to put in place these weird satellites up in space that would have lasers on them, and they would detect any incoming missiles, and they would shoot them down, whatever. And Sagan was like, dude, this isn't gonna help. This isn't gonna solve the problem. This isn't gonna de-escalate the war. This is actually only gonna make things worse. It's only gonna exacerbate the war. Because at the time, there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons around the world. And America and the Soviet Union were just playing a game to see who can be stronger and bigger, who can build the more bombs. So they were kind of trying to scare each other like two bullies in a playground, right? But from his hospital bed, Carl Sagan drafted a petition, and he called upon lots of his friend scientists to, sign the petition to stop this Star Wars program. A lot of people called it Star Wars back then to kind of make fun of it. So after he came out of the hospital, he began to realize that this was his next thing. He put aside a lot of his projects. At the time, he was working on Galileo with the NASA Ames Research Center. And he kind of put those projects aside, and he kind of left those projects. And he, in his words, jokingly, he said, I'm going to put these projects aside. I'm going to try to save the world now. Or he wanted to save the world. So after that, he began to do interviews and talks and lectures across the world. And he went on TV shows and, talked to all kinds of people in a very short period of time. In the early 80s, he would do so many lectures. And he even went to Congress. He testified before Congress, debating with someone called Edward Teller, who was a physicist who was behind the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller was, of course, an advocate for nuclear testing and nuclear weapons, and Carl Sagan opposed him, right? And they were debated, and during the Congress session, Carl Sagan made them look like fools. Carl Sagan showed them the diagrams of the paper, showed them that wheat crop yields would decrease, even with a little bit of temperature change. Crop yields would vastly decrease and cause starvation, mass starvation around the world. Edward Teller would kind of exaggerate things and say, Soviet Unions, they're looking to test more and more. They're actually looking to plan an attack on us, I think. I think they're really planning to attack us for real this time. And, of course, Carl Sagan threw a wrench in this and said, well, even a modest war, even a small war, would have a tremendous impact on the world around us, still killing millions of people, right? Still having no winner. So after that, a lot of Congress people started to question the SDI program, even though a lot of NASA scientists were like, okay, let's just do what Reagan wants to do. Carl Sagan had to intervene and talk them out of that. And, he really got everybody behind his back. Even the Pope at the time invited Carl Sagan to the Vatican to talk about nuclear winter. And in 1986, Carl Sagan went to the Soviet Union to talk to the Soviet Central Committee. This is like the power behind the Soviet Union, right? This is like going up to the White House. And Carl Sagan made his case to the Soviets. He talked about nuclear winter. He introduced his article in the paper to Gorbachev and the scientists of the time, the Soviet scientists. And after the meeting, some of the scientists in that committee knew it was over. They knew the Cold War was over because the Soviet scientists were convinced, and they were able to convince Gorbachev to reduce the nuclear arsenals. So this inspired them to really dramatically reduce their nuclear weapons. And a few months later, Gorbachev and President Reagan met and signed a treaty or a deal to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. They began to slowly decrease their nuclear arsenals. Gorbachev, when he was meeting with Reagan, had a copy in his hand of the Parade article that Carl Sagan wrote, as well as a book called Together on Mars. It turns out that Carl Sagan, when he was talking to the Soviets, convinced them to channel all that nuclear energy into going to Mars. Carl Sagan loved Mars, and he kind of convinced them to, hey, instead of doing nuclear war, let's use this power to do something great where both countries can be united in this. Carl Sagan wanted to unite Soviet Union and America and both going to Mars. And I just imagine having people see that in national television around the world. Both countries uniting, going to Mars. That'd be a great thing. And in 1988, Gorbachev actually mentioned in one of his talks to Reagan that Carl Sagan, he mentioned Carl Sagan by name and said that he was a major influence in why they decided to stop producing nuclear weapons. Because at the time, the America's Department of Defense was not looking at the consequences to this, right? And it was Carl Sagan who really spoke out and showed people with his actions and his knowledge and with his great communication skills that something needs to change. Sagan even got arrested a few times in Nevada for protesting against nuclear testing. Like, Sagan actually did things. He didn't just say it, he did all the above. He went above and beyond, man, to really make a tremendous impact on the Cold War. And even today, many Russian colleagues say that Carl Sagan was one of the major influences that ended the Cold War. Now, Edward Teller, the guy who opposed Sagan, was kind of salty at Sagan up until he died. Because one time Sagan and him were having breakfast, and a bunch of people came up to Sagan for his autograph, but nobody seemed to recognize Teller. So after that, he was salty and did not like Sagan at all. But I think it shows that, man, you can make an impact. One person can have a huge impact on the world without, being violent or without doing any of that, with using knowledge. Knowledge is power. And to quote Sagan, who helped President Carter produce his farewell address, he specifically helped the nuclear arms section of the address. He said, "Nuclear weapons are an expression of one side of our human character. But there's another side. The same rocket technology that delivers nuclear warheads has also taken us peacefully into space. And from that perspective, we see our Earth as it really is, a small and fragile and beautiful blue globe, the only home we have. We see no barriers of race or religion or country. We see the essential unity of our species and our planet. And with faith and common sense, that bright vision will ultimately prevail." And now, today, our nuclear arsenals are a quarter of what they were in the 1980s. And people are more aware of nuclear winter. And a lot of that has likely stopped and prevented nuclear war from happening. So, thank you, Sagan, for your efforts. And thank you guys for watching. See you next time.